I'm John McKee, editor of Messianic Apologetics, messianicapologetics.net. And I would like to welcome you to this episode of Messianic Insider, your theology and news roundup for October the 17th, 2025. As announced yesterday, our theology roundup will be discussing the composition of the book of Genesis. This upcoming Shabbat begins a new Torah cycle through Bereshit in the beginning. And I know that for many of us, we've gone through the annual Torah cycle many, many times. But how many are actually aware of some of the important composition data as well as debates as it involves the composition of the book of Genesis? I know that for many people across the Messianic spectrum, they simply conclude, well, Moses wrote Genesis. And I'm sorry to say, but one of the serious weaknesses of a great deal of Messianic theology is the inability to engage with not only liberal, but even some conservative perspectives as they involve the composition of the books of the Torah, the Pentateuchal books. All right, so our study for today in our theology roundup is taken from our ministry publication, A Survey of the Holy Scriptures for the Practical Messianic. It's available in both paperback as well as ebook for Amazon Kindle. This is a compilation of our previous workbooks, A Survey of the Tanakh and A Survey of the Apostolic Scriptures. And it does not attempt to hide in any way that there are indeed liberal approaches out there to things like the book of Genesis, which we definitely need to be informed about. This doesn't say that, I am necessarily liberal, but anybody who gets a well-rounded theological education is going to be informed about debates over Mosaic authorship of the Torah. And this most especially involves things like the book of Genesis. So let's switch screens really quickly and we'll get into this. All right, there we go. So the book of Genesis. If you choose to go through A Survey of the Holy Scriptures workbook, it is recommended, as challenging as it may be, but as useful as it may be, for you to sit down in a single sitting and read the book of Genesis. And as you do this, keep a journal log or a notebook of key people, places, themes and events, and major scripture passages. And indeed, as you do that, you're going to be able to pick up a lot of things from Genesis, or any book of the Bible for that matter, as your personal survey will help you figure out what a text like Genesis means for you. All right, so let's get into the theological summary. This is where things get interesting, because you're just not going to see me be some kind of a repeater of a hyper-conservative approach to a text like Genesis. I'm the kind of person who's not going to hide that there are other points of view out there. The approximate date for the writing of Genesis, 1440 to 1400 BCE, those on the right. 1300 to 1200 BCE, conservative moderates, and that, of course, depends on how you date the Exodus. But then the 500s BCE, those on the left. The time period of the material in Genesis, the creation of the world to Israel and Egypt. The author of Genesis, this is where things definitely get interesting and where there are some things which don't get discussed in today's Messianic experience. Moses exclusively those on the right. Moses, Joshua, and later editors, conservative moderates. Or compiled traditions and mythologies, those on the left. The location of the author, mainly the wilderness journey after the Exodus, right, conservative moderate. Babylon and or the land of Israel, those on the left. And then finally, the target audience and their location, wilderness journey after the Exodus, right, conservative moderate. Babylon and or land of Israel, those on the left. That probably needs to be fixed. Let's go to composition of Exodus. No, that would be largely correct. It would be those, let's check. Okay. People of Israel wandering in the desert, right, conservative, moderate. Jewish exiles returning from Babylon, those on the left. We'll get that fixed. Okay. I'm sorry about that. Okay. Let's go into a theological summary of the book of Genesis. The Hebrew title of the first book of the Bible is Bereshit, pronounced Bereshis in the Ashkenazic tradition, where the final tav or the final t is often pronounced as an s. Coming from the first sentence in the text, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1:1, New American Standard. Our term Genesis is derived from the Greek Septuagint, which uses the term Geneseos in Genesis 2:4, describing the book of the origin of heaven and earth. New English translation of the Septuagint. This passed over into the Latin Vulgate as Liber Genesis. In the Jewish tradition, the full title of Genesis is Sefer HaBereshit and referred to by some as Sefer HaYesharim, or Book of the Upright. The theme of the book of Genesis is undoubtedly beginnings. Quote, Genesis covers an immensely long period of time, longer perhaps than the rest of the Bible put together. It begins in the distant past of creation, an event about whose absolute date we cannot even speculate, through millennia to reach Abraham at the end of chapter 11, unquote. From the Dillard and Longman, An Introduction to the Old Testament. If the lifespans of the early genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11 are added together, then the text itself covers almost 2,400 years. Specifically, it would cover 1,948 years from Adam to Abraham, and then 361 years to the death of Joseph, equaling 2,309 years. If one considers there to be missing generations or individuals via a telescoped genealogy, and that would mean A begat the line resulting in B, so some of those genealogies may include a great-great-great-grandfather or a great-great-great-grandson, something like that. Then the time span between creation and the patriarchs becomes considerably longer, with human history certainly going back 18,000 to 20,000 years, or much, much further back. The wide breadth of space and history which Genesis covers cannot be ignored by any able interpreter. Several, if not multiplied, millennia of human history are covered in Genesis's first 12 chapters. Geographically, Genesis can be divided into two principal segments. This first segment, Genesis chapters 1 through 38, comprises a great deal about what is known about humans living in Mesopotamia. Many conservative examiners are agreed that the Garden of Eden was likely located in the vicinity of Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia was the original home of Abram. Isaac's wife Rachel was from Mesopotamia, and Jacob lived in Mesopotamia for 20 years. The homeland of the original Hebrews was, in no uncertain terms, found in Mesopotamia. Various other parallels exist between the customs and laws followed by the patriarchs and what was followed in Mesopotamia, in spite of them transplanting themselves westward to Canaan. Of extreme importance is the fact of distinct Mesopotamian influence on the first parts of Genesis. R.K. Harrison notes how, quote, on the whole, English translations of the first dozen or so chapters of Genesis are so literal that they betray the translator's ignorance of the Mesopotamian background that Genesis so faithfully reflects, unquote. International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. Quote, there can be no real question as to the immense antiquity of the source material that is to be found in Genesis, unquote, from Harrison's Introduction to the Old Testament. Bible readers cannot ignore some distinct parallels between what is seen in the Hebrew Bible and what is recorded in Mesopotamian works, such as the Enuma Elish creation story and Epic of Gilgamesh disastrous flood. You probably haven't frequently heard about comparisons and contrasts between the Genesis creation and flood accounts and the Enuma Elish and Epic of Gilgamesh stories. However, it must be noted that there are severe differences as well. Quote, the Babylonian account depicts the creation as taking place as a result of the sexual union of the gods. It is patently mythical and pagan in its orientation, unquote. New International Dictionary of the Bible. This is contrary to a divine creator making humankind in his own image and being one who cares for his creatures. The Mesopotamian stories were nothing more than perverse preservations of the true biblical account. Quote, it would not then be at all surprising if the story concerning them should come to be mythologized in pagan traditions while being preserved in authentically historical form within the stream of tradition of which Genesis 1 through 11 is the inspired deposit, unquote, from Meredith Kline, New Bible Commentary Revised. It is probable, though, that the author of Genesis knew of these myths when composing the text. This first segment of Genesis can largely be broken up into two halves. The first half deals with what might be called primeval or prehistory, the period from Adam to the appearance of Abraham, Genesis 1:1 to 11:26. This largely covers the creation and fall of humanity, the spread of sin in the early world, Noah's flood, and the Tower of Babel. The second half of this segment deals with the patriarchal history, Genesis 11:27 to 38:1, covering the lives of Abraham and Isaac, Genesis 11:27 to 25:11, and then with Isaac and Jacob, Genesis 25:19 to 35:29, 37:1. These parts record Abraham's journey to Canaan, the judgment of God upon Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham's offering up Isaac for a sacrifice. They are interspersed by the genealogies of Ishmael, Genesis 25:12 to 28, and Esau, Genesis chapter 36. The second major segment of Genesis chapters 39 to 50, which covers far less time, sees the scene shift from Canaan to Egypt. From Genesis 39:2 to 50, verse 26, readers see the lives of Jacob and Joseph and the 12 sons of Israel having to move into Egypt. Readers also get a feel for the ancient Hebrews' lives in Egypt, and as a result, it is witnessed how the author of Genesis was quite familiar with the Egyptian civilization, with careful attention given in this part to specific agricultural advances made and perfected by Egypt. The authorship of Genesis is a lively debate in modern theology and has been since the mid-18th century. Most, regardless of their position, are agreed that Genesis should not be read on its own without some connection to the rest of the Torah or Pentateuch, Exodus through Deuteronomy, as the story continues on. It is important to remember Genesis, quote, was not written as an independent and complete volume, unquote, New Interpreter Study Bible. But as one can imagine, reading the book of Genesis in light of the rest of the Torah has caused a great deal of controversy. Historically, both Jews and Christians have held to the position of some kind of Mosaic authorship, even though Genesis is, in a strict sense, anonymous. Varied ancient traditions, both inside and outside of the Bible, Jewish and Christian, almost all attest to Moses being the author of Genesis, at least before 1750. The principal witness which exists for believers in Israel's Messiah, attesting to genuine Mosaic authorship, is actually the Apostolic Scriptures or New Testament. Acts 15:1, for example, treats the rite of circumcision as being according to the custom of Moses, New American Standard, even if there it involved some rabbinic additions, a direct allusion to Genesis 17. A consensus reading of the Apostolic Scriptures assigns some level of the Torah's authorship to Moses, Mark 12:26, Luke 24:27, Romans 10:5, 2 Corinthians 3:15, especially John 1:45 and 5:46. Philip also found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Yeshua of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." John 1:45, New American Standard. "For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me." John 5:46, New American Standard. All of the specific quotations in the Apostolic Scriptures from Yeshua or the Apostles ascribe Moses as being the author of the Torah. Quote, "The New Testament endorses the Jewish tradition of Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, not excluding Genesis," unquote. Meredith Kline, New Bible Commentary, Revised. John H. Sailhamer further repeats, quote, "It appears relatively certain that Jesus and the writers of the New Testament believed that Moses was the author of the Pentateuch," unquote. So, for anyone to deny the presence of Moses' authority in composing the Torah, such a person is going against the testimony of the Messiah and the apostles. Now, listen very carefully, because this is where things diverge a little, and I suspect this is not the kind of approach you have ever heard in a Messianic Torah study. There are, however, conservative moderates who believe in principal Mosaic authorship of Genesis, but do allow for post-Mosaic editing in some distinct references. Quote, "The concept of Mosaic authorship does not demand the belief that Moses was the first to write every word of each account in the book of Genesis. It is generally understood today to mean that much of his work was compilation," unquote. New International Dictionary of the Bible. Verses which clearly indicate post-Mosaic editing of Genesis include the mention of Dan, Genesis 14:14, a list of kings who reigned in the land of Edom, Genesis 36:31, and a reference to the land of Ramses, Genesis 47:11. Many, quote, "conservative Christians have been too quick to distance themselves from the possibility of sources and too close to any evidence of significant post-Mosaic activity, unquote, from Dillard and Longman's Old Testament introduction. And the idea of exclusive Mosaic authorship of Genesis permeates the vast majority of today's Messianic community, with almost no room for one to maneuver sometimes. Indeed, it's been an unfortunate observation for me over many years that the composition of the books of the Bible is one area where Messianic theology is very, very much underdeveloped. In affirming Mosaic authorship of the book of Genesis, no one should conclude that Moses was the author of every single letter. First, it is not known if Moses used scribes to compile the earliest edition of Genesis. And secondly, it is quite probable that Moses did incorporate outside materials into its composition. Harrison speculates that the material for Genesis chapters 1 through 36, including the story of creation and the flood, originally existed on cuneiform tablets, and that such information was adapted by Moses for the canonical Genesis account. Quote, if it is correct to assume that the first 36 chapters of Genesis had originally had an independent existence as cuneiform tablets, it would have been a comparatively easy matter for a talented person such as Moses to compile the canonical book by arranging the tablets in a rough chronological order, unquote. International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. Conservatives generally believe that, quote, the writer of the book of Genesis appears to have composed his work from archival records of God's great deeds in the past. The narratives within the book of Genesis appear to be largely made up of small, self-contained stories worked together into larger units by means of various geographical and genealogical tables. If such is in fact the case, one should not expect to find absolute uniformity of style, etc., among all the individual narratives, any more than an absolute uniformity can be expected in later historical books, unquote, from Sailhamer. Some divide the material for Genesis 1:1 to 37:2 into 11 possible tablets, noting, quote, to what extent Moses wrote any of its contents, with the possible exception of all or part of the Joseph narratives, is unknown, unquote, from Harrison. Introduction to the Old Testament. Moses may be better described as the principal compiler of Genesis, if indeed he took patriarchal traditions which had been passed down within the community of Israel and via God's Spirit integrated them into his authorized religious instruction. It is notable that having been raised in Egypt, he would have seen that the original Genesis was written on leather, a more preferred and durable material than clay. The author of Genesis had a knowledge of Egypt, Genesis 13:10, and the Egyptian language, Genesis 41:43 to 45, certainly pointing to Moses. We must, however, consider the fact that whatever was written in Moses' time was composed in the Paleo-Hebrew or Phoenician script, whereas what is canonical in Judaism is in Assyrian or Babylonian block script, acquired by the Jewish exiles who were taken to Babylon. Listen to this. The Talmud details how Ezra the priest was responsible for the final composition of the Tanakh in its current block script. Talmud Sanhedrin 21b. And so the Torah, and thus Genesis as it exists in its final form, is a product of the post-Babylonian exile. And let me read to you that quotation in case you've never seen it before. And even though the Torah was not given through Ezra, the script was changed through him. Sanhedrin 21b. Now, our ministry falls well within the conservative moderate position of Mosaic authorship of the book of Genesis. And we are certainly not advocates of the critical view, which we will get into in just a moment. We cannot ignore the broad array of events in history which Genesis covers, including the incorporation of outside sources into Genesis. So it is best to say that we believe in, quote, essential authorship, unquote, of Moses, Dillard and Longman, allowing for possible later editing by individuals such as Joshua or Ezra the priest. Now, this is something that I know many of you have never heard before. The common critical view of the composition of Genesis, and indeed the entire Torah, is one which most Messianics are not even aware of. And I can definitely say that, especially since I first started attending seminary 20 years ago and took Old Testament introduction 19 years ago. Liberals all deny any Mosaic authorship of Genesis and instead adhere to some kind of documentary hypothesis. The most widely advocated of these theories is commonly called JEDP, which is believed to string together various religious traditions from distinct elements or religious traditions within ancient Israel. Forms of this theory have existed since the mid-1700s and were popularized in Germany in the mid-1800s, specifically by Julius Wellhausen. It is often based on factors such as differing literary styles, usage of the divine name, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, alleged contradictions in the text, and perceived developments in Israel's religion, although there have been significant scholars who have challenged it. The critical tradition advocates that the Jewish exiles returning from Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE compiled various traditions into now what is called the Torah, ascribing authorship to Moses. Extreme liberals believe that the story of creation and the flood are largely myths, perhaps coupled with other local legends, such as the judgment upon Sodom and Gomorrah. Perhaps Abraham existed as a quasi-historical figure, or perhaps not, but never as prominent as Genesis portrays him. Furthermore, many have tried to postulate that the religion of ancient Israel developed from polytheistic to monotheistic. So any references in the Hebrew text to Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, the J source, and why is it represented as J and not Y? Because in German, the divine name is spelled with a J. Of course, those of you who study German or Dutch, some of the other related languages, know it's pronounced as a Y. Or Elohim, E, are believed to be viewed as references to two different deities. This view came to prominence in a time highly dominated by social Darwinism and was undeniably affected by the theory of evolution. Critical views which deny the historicity of the book of Genesis are frequently developed by people who deny anything supernatural. Conservative views are commonly criticized as, quote, being shaken by modern natural science, especially by biology and Darwinism, unquote. Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible Supplement. While JEDP is a very common theory to hear in liberal Christian seminaries, many Jews likewise believe in it. Many in Jewish and Christian institutes think that they have to agree with the JEDP documentary hypothesis as part of an establishment consensus. Nahum Sarna validly points out in his Genesis commentary, quote, it is beyond doubt that the book of Genesis came down to us not as a composite of disparate elements, but as a unified document with a life, coherence, and integrity of its own. For this reason, a fragmentary approach to it cannot provide an adequate understanding of the whole, unquote. A good trend in biblical scholarship among liberals appearing more and more, is acknowledging some kind of unity in Genesis on literary grounds. All readers have to deal with the text in its final form, even though some Mosaic involvement in Genesis composition will still be denied on some level. From a textual standpoint, the major witnesses extant of the book of Genesis are the Hebrew Masoretic text, Samaritan Pentateuch, the Greek Septuagint, and Genesis fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. On the whole, the Hebrew textual witnesses of Genesis are very good, but on occasion it can be necessary to find a better reading evident in a secondary version because of Genesis antiquity. This is especially true of translation into English, where the Hebrew Masoretic text can be unclear or vague, and the Greek Septuagint may give a translator clues as to what a clearer rendering in English can be. The theological message of Genesis is clear to anyone who reads it. Genesis must be understood for a person to understand the rest of the Bible. Genesis lays the groundwork via the promises given by God to Abraham for the establishment of the nation of Israel, and most importantly, lays the groundwork for understanding the Messiah to come. Genesis is highly monotheistic, as Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph are all seen relating themselves to a single deity. Bible readers see God relating to humanity and both love and judgment in Genesis, characteristics seen throughout the rest of Scripture. As Genesis lays the foundation for the rest of the Bible, and specifically the Torah, one sees how that Israel was not just an emerging nation brought about by random chance, but by God directly intervening in the lives of people. It is seen how God has a plan of blessing all the peoples of planet Earth through the line of Abraham, Genesis 12, 1 through 3, and the beginning of the people who will accomplish this blessing as his representatives. Sarna summarizes that, quote, the entire Hebrew Bible is both God-centered and Israel-centered, unquote. So any examination of Genesis by Messianic people today must be done by us seeing what God's ultimate agenda is for the world: to see humanity's restoration to himself. Not surprisingly, some of the themes seen at the beginning of Genesis are repeated at the end of Revelation. When we consider the theology of today's Messianic movement, some challenges exist in our present approach to Genesis. While many Messianic people engage in a consistent study of the Torah, including Genesis, some tend to make the reverse mistake of liberals who deny that its miraculous events took place. Some Messianics have an overly mythical view of Genesis, which can result from consulting ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic Jewish sources at the expense of understanding Genesis in the context of the ancient Near East. Honest inquiries about human origins in the greater universe are often dismissed. We would do well in the future to adapt a more conservative, moderate view of Genesis, where we fully affirm the accuracy of the text, that God did indeed create the world intentionally with humans made by his intelligent design, that these people and the events actually did take place, and that these accounts provide a vivid picture of God's love, but also his judgment. We need to engage with more commentaries and references which do not skirt around the controversies existing with Genesis, so that our faith can be strengthened and we can truly see the supernatural interacting with the natural. Okay, so that concludes some of the theological summary. And yes, I'm going to have to go back in the file and probably make a few small fixes. I just want you all to know we do not use AI in the production of any of our materials. Okay, so if you're going through the survey of Genesis and the survey of the Holy Scriptures workbook, here we've got questions for reflection on Genesis. So in your notebook, after you've sit down and you've read through Genesis, you've kept a listing of key people, places, events, etc., then you've read the theological summary provided here. There are a number of big questions, such as, for example, question number 7, summarize the events in the early life of Jacob. Which one do you think requires further inquiry on your part? Questions like that. Question number 11, here's a big one. Which issue or issues seen in the book of Genesis do you think may shake Messianic Bible examination in the future? Do you think there is anything in Genesis which the Messianic community might be avoiding? That second question, yes. And then, of course, also in your journal, write 2 short paragraphs about what struck you about reading the book of Genesis. Survey of Genesis, survey of its contents. Have you ever gone through it in some kind of a messianic context, a messianic way? This is something surely important for our still developing and maturing messianic theology. All right, let me switch windows back. All right, here we go. Yes, and just to close up this segment, this examination has been taken from our ministry publication, A Survey of the Holy Scriptures for the Practical Messianic, available both paperback as well as ebook for Amazon Kindle. All right, so let's now switch over to our news roundup. And we go through the news roundup after the theology roundup because news is something which is time sensitive and it changes day to day. For example, right as we were getting ready to go live, we know that Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is presently in Washington, supposed to meet with President Trump at the White House today. We definitely have that situation, Russia-Ukraine, to pay attention to. We are steadfastly reminded, number one, continue to pray for peace in the Middle East, the implementation of the Trump peace plan. The living hostages have been returned to Israel. We pray for their quick recovery, getting reunited with their families, reintegrated into society. They've gone through an experience they will never forget. And we know that that is something which is psychologically as well as physically jarring. Some of them are going to have physical maladies the rest of their lives because of this. Number two, we do pray for peace, Russia and Ukraine. We don't need to see that get out of hand. And number three, we have some situations unfolding here on the American home front, so we pray for reason and sanity to prevail. Now, all the news stories I'm about to go through, these are things which I encounter passively on social media. All these links should be available for you later today to look through, read the articles, watch the different clips when this episode is archived on MessianicApologetics.net. Okay, our first story, this is yesterday from the New York Post, October the 16th. Breaking, President Trump announced Thursday that high-level U.S. and Russian officials will meet next week and that he will talk face-to-face with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Hungary to try again to end Moscow's war on Ukraine. Yes, and indeed, we definitely pray that that is something which is possible and that that can take place, because there have been too many Ukrainians, too many Russians who have died in a needless conflict. And I just want to politely remind a lot of people, one of the reasons why you don't hear about this conflict that much in the Messianic sphere of influence is because after North America, where the largest Messianic Jewish community is found, the second largest Messianic Jewish community is in Ukraine. And then the third largest is in Russia. And so it's very difficult to talk about this because many of us know Messianic Jewish believers with family ties to Ukraine, Russia. Some of them have even come from Ukraine and Russia. And some of them even have family internal family disputes over who's right and who's wrong in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So that's why you haven't necessarily heard a lot of discussion about this geopolitically from a Messianic standpoint. Okay, so along with that, this is open source intel forwarding on a Donald Trump Truth Social post. Trump says he plans to meet with Putin next week in Hungary. Okay, we will, of course, see if that actually materializes, but at least that is part of the plan. Now, yesterday on Messianic Insider, as we were getting ready to start, that's when President Trump was in the middle of a phone conversation with President Putin. Here's a 1 minute, 7 second clip from Fox News forwarded on by Rapid Response 47. Press Secretary, and that's Carolyn Levitt, on President Trump's call with President Putin today, so that's yesterday. They have agreed to convene a meeting of their high-level staff next week to continue these very important discussions, which may be followed by yet another meeting between President Trump and President Putin. Okay, so that's at least in the works. And of course, with what has taken place in the past week, with the president going to Jerusalem, and then later Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and seeing all those Arab and Muslim leaders there, that peace agreement, there's a lot of momentum now for peace to emerge between Russia and Ukraine. Now, as it concerns that Middle East peace, from open source intel yesterday at 1:36 p.m., Jerusalem Post, Israel has blocked the entry of a Turkish delegation that includes rescue teams and heavy machinery from entering the Gaza Strip, Israeli officials said. Hamas can immediately return the bodies of the abducted. There's no reason to allow Turkish crews into Gaza. Senior Israeli officials added that Hamas knows the location of most of the hostages' remains. In many cases, they said Hamas is aware where the bodies are buried and can reach them, though in some instances, heavy equipment would be needed for recovery. Okay, this is the kind of report that, of course, changes from day to day. We can expect, this is, of course, a little speculative, but with all of those different Arab and Muslim powers agreeing to this Trump peace plan, with countries especially like Turkey and Qatar involved, and then others involved like the United Arab Emirates, possibly Egypt, you can't expect 100% agreement and 100% cooperation among all those different countries. They all have various competing agendas, and how much of that delays the implementation of the Trump peace plan. So just keep that in mind. I don't think any of us, in seeing the president go to Jerusalem and then Sharm el-Sheikh, expected absolute immediate implementation without any bumps on the way. This is the Middle East we're talking about. That's something impossible. Okay, some of you are probably aware of the spat between Ambassador Mike Huckabee and Matt Gaetz. So here is a post, Matt Gaetz, a quote from the Times of Israel. Huckabee said he would warn American Christians that their donations are not received warmly and that tourists should reconsider any plans to visit Israel if the issue is not resolved. And of course, Matt Gaetz is trying to stir up this idea that Christians who go to Israel, they visit Israel, they're not really welcome. Many of them are harassed or even spit on. And he asks Ambassador Huckabee, were you misquoted by the Times of Israel? So here you see Ambassador Huckabee saying, and this is from yesterday afternoon, did you read the letter, Matt Gaetz? It clearly said, if the issue is not resolved. Well, the letter got immediate attention and the issue was resolved. I wasn't misquoted by the Times of Israel. I was misquoted by you. Yes, along with some of the other social media influencers out there who have veered a less than positive path to approaching different Israel and Jewish issues, questions are now being raised about what's taking place with Matt Gaetz. With a lot of people relieved that he was not confirmed as the Attorney General. Okay, from open source intel, Trump on Hamas executing Gazans. And this is from October the 16th. There's a 45-second clip. I'm looking at what's happening. We have a commitment from them, and I assume they're going to honor that commitment. If they behave, good. If they don't behave, we'll take care of it. Yes, given the relative cessation of hostilities between Israel and Gaza, it should not be a surprise that there are different reports out from Gaza that Gazans who would have seemingly collaborated with Israel are going to be subject to harassment at the very least, and probably even some level of violence. But just file this away. We know that we're still waiting to see the dust settle from a lot of what has taken place. Okay, from Visegrad 24, and you all can read all of this in your spare time, but this was posted 1:39 p.m., so right after we finished yesterday's episode. Trump and Putin spoke for nearly 2.5 hours. Putin's aide, Yuri Ushakov, revealed details of the conversation. And so, among other things, Putin told Trump that U.S. deliveries of Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine will not change the situation on the battlefield. One of Trump's main points, according to Ushakov, was that ending the conflict would open up major economic opportunities between the two countries. The two leaders agreed to arrange an in-person meeting, possibly in Budapest. And scrolling down, the call was initiated by Russia. So I would say, on the whole, the fact that it was initiated by Russia, that's a good thing. They do want to see this matter wrapped up. But we wait and see. Okay, now to the American home front. This is from the New York Post. It's not the only story, but this is from yesterday afternoon, the 16th of October. Breaking: a federal grand jury on Thursday indicted former Trump National Security Advisor John Bolton. You remember his home was raided for classified documents on charges of mishandling classified information, accusing him of sending sensitive national security documents through a personal AOL email account. So John Bolton here was indicted. And he's one of the major neocons out there. He was the national security advisor for a season in the first Trump administration, the first Trump term. Okay, so back to Matt Gaetz and Mike Huckabee. Here we have Matt Gaetz responding to Mike Huckabee. Breaking: Ambassador Huckabee explains how his boycott, divestment, and sanction threat worked. Now, are we going to continue to see a back and forth between Matt Gaetz and Mike Huckabee? What else is Matt Gaetz going to do? Okay, we got 4 more stories, and then we'll close up. Okay, so this is from CNN on Instagram yesterday. President Donald Trump showed off models of an Independence Arch, which the administration is considering building near Arlington National Cemetery to commemorate the country's 250th anniversary. Some of you all have seen this. It looks very similar to the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. Of course, there are going to be a lot of questions about is this something that America needs to be spending its money on? See one of these comments on Instagram. Grand architecture has always been a key aspect of fascism. Okay, everyone's entitled to their opinion. But many of us, we see, of course, the Trump family, they are real estate developers. So building something like a grand ballroom at the White House, building some kind of an Independence Arch in Washington, D.C., these are the kinds of things we would expect them to propose, things which Trump can leave as memorials of his presidency. Will it happen? Will it not happen? We wait and see. But it is something doubtlessly to be representative of what he considers to be the golden age of America. Okay, yeah, here's a story which is unfolding in our backyard here in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. Gateway Church. This is from Julie Roy's. We're just going to note what the issue is. Gateway Church is now facing allegations under the federal RICO Act, a statute typically used against organized crime, after members accused the megachurch of defrauding donors. Okay, now we know right now that Pastor Robert Morris is serving a term up in Oklahoma for the problems involving him. Now we have a problem here being reported. Gateway Church, even the RICO Act, of course, it has to do with tithes and offerings and donations. This is something we have to be concerned about as the Messianic community, because Gateway Church, that enterprise directly intersects with the Messianic Jewish movement because of Gateway Center for Israel. There are a lot of Messianic Jewish ministries which are caught up in the Gateway network, and many Messianic Jewish leaders are getting theological education via the King's University, which is a subsidiary of Gateway Church. So what could happen if Gateway Church is harmed by a lot of this? That's something we need to pray about, and it's not going to end up well any way it goes. Okay, two more stories. Okay, this is from Rapid Response 47 this morning, October the 17th. That's President Trump with Maria Bartiromo. Now, this is from earlier in the week. POTUS. Okay, to the question, do you expect an expansion of the Abraham Accords? POTUS, I do. The Abraham Accords are a miracle in a way, and the 4 countries that went in initially, they stayed in, and they're doing incredibly well. I hope to see Saudi Arabia go in, and I hope to see others go in. So that's something, of course, this isn't the first time we've noted that. We saw all of those Arab and Muslim leaders in Egypt. Now, countries like Egypt, Jordan, they have individual peace treaties with Israel. They could easily join the Abraham Accords, but in particular, it's these countries which don't have open diplomatic relations with the state of Israel we're looking at. And of course, the biggest one of them all is the jewel of the Arab Muslim world, and that is Saudi Arabia. They've doubtlessly all have, back channel communications. Their diplomats meet with one another here and there. But there's little doubting when you see a lot of this talk why people are speculating about the Daniel 9:27 covenant with many. Okay, and then one final story. This is from the New York Post on Instagram. Breaking, former National Security Advisor John Bolton, a fixture of the GOP foreign policy establishment in D.C. for decades, surrendered to authorities on Friday after being indicted by a federal grand jury for allegedly mishandling classified information. And we know that Bolton has pleaded not guilty, and we, of course, will wait and see. But the question, of course, a lot of people are having with something like this is, what about the other things which we've heard about over the past few months? Russiagate, Epstein, the auto pen, Joe Biden. Here we've got John Bolton. What else are we going to see? It's not going to end up well because regardless of whether you're on the right, the left, the center, people's trust in their elected officials, people's trust in government officials is going to be challenged. Yet, we know as citizens of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, as his sons and daughters, we can rely on the eternal God of the universe for our answers, and he can be trusted. All right, so that concludes our news roundup. And before we conclude this next Shabbat, and you should be able to see these posts as they are made available. Over the next 2 months, I will be starting the next new members, new foundations class at my local congregation, Etz Chaim of Plano, Texas. This has been a class I've taught since 2016. The past 2 years, we have recorded the different presentations and made them available, of course, mainly to the people taking the class, but available to everyone else. And the next class starts tomorrow morning. So late afternoon-ish, after I get back, you should be expecting to see those episodes posted live on Messianic Apologetics YouTube channel, as well as to our audio podcast. And every class is different, and for certain, you should be able to pick up things about the Messianic Jewish experience, ranging from the Messianic Jewish mission, lifestyle, as well as different theological controversies. And of course, the future, as it involves what is happening today in Israel, the Middle East, and what is being done or not being done about this. As always, on behalf of Outreach Israel Ministries and Messianic Apologetics, I would like to sincerely thank you for your ongoing prayers, encouragement, and donations toward all of our ministry efforts. If you have not already, please do go to our website, messianicapologetics.net. There you can access a wide array of free articles, frequently asked questions entries, back issues of Outreach Israel News, and you can check into some back episodes of Messianic Insider, McKee Moment Shorts, etc. We'll see you again on Monday with another episode of Messianic Insider. Until then, may God bless you. Shabbat Shalom, and take care.